Black Shy Girl noticed the symptoms. Everyone ignored and ended up saving the CEO's life. The Sapphire Bay Resort in Malibu, California, stood as a monument to wealth, its polished granite floors gleaming under the soft glow of cascading glass chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceilings. The air carried a hushed reverence, the kind of silence that only money could command, broken only by the faint crash of Pacific waves beyond the manicured grounds. Amara Johnson, a 27-year-old black woman, moved through this opulent world like a shadow, her cleaning cart trailing behind her like a loyal, silent companion. Her uniform was crisp, but unremarkable, save for a faded pin that read "Student Nurse," a quiet testament to a dream she'd buried years ago. To the guests who lounged in the resort's plush suites or sipped cocktails by the infinity pool, Amara was invisible, a fleeting presence who tidied their lives without leaving a trace. She was the one who scrubbed their marble bathrooms, fluffed their Egyptian cotton pillows, and vanished before they could register her existence. Her dark eyes, sharp and observant, caught details others missed, but no one noticed her noticing. She was the girl who cleaned the rooms of people who earned more in a single hour than she did in an entire year, and she'd learned to accept that her role was to be unseen, her voice unheard. Room 1408 was no different from the others in its extravagance, but its occupant set it apart. Ethan Caldwell, a tech mogul whose medical software empire had revolutionized hospitals across the globe, had checked in under a cloud of controversy. Lawsuits piled up against him, accusing his company of cutting corners, prioritizing profits over patients. The media had turned on him once, hailing him as a visionary, but now questioning his judgment, his ethics, his very legacy. Sapphire Bay was his refuge, a place to escape the scrutiny of a world that no longer bowed to his name. To Ethan, Amara was nothing more than a fixture, useful, silent, forgettable. He barely glanced at her when she entered his suite each morning, her cart gliding soundlessly over the hardwood floors. He'd bark orders without looking up from his laptop, his voice clipped and commanding extra towels, or "Clean the windows today." Amara would nod, her lips pressed into a thin line, and do as she was told. The hierarchy was clear, etched into every interaction. He was the god of this space, and she was the servant who existed to maintain it. His world was one of power and privilege, where his word was law and hers didn't exist. But Amara carried a secret. Ethan couldn't see, a connection to medicine that ran deeper than his algorithms and software. It lived in the lessons her mother had taught her, a nurse whose hands had healed countless patients but couldn't save herself. 5 years ago, Amara's mother had died from a misdiagnosed illness, a rare autoimmune condition mistaken for pneumonia by doctors who dismissed her concerns as nurse anxiety. They'd told her she was overreacting, that healthcare workers often imagined themselves sicker than they were. By the time the truth came to light, her organs were shutting down, and Amara, just 22, watched her mother slip away in a hospital bed, her faith in the medical system shattered. The day after the funeral, Amara walked away from nursing school, convinced she'd never be smart enough, credentialed enough, or important enough to matter in a world ruled by degrees and white coats. She traded her textbooks for a cleaning cart, her ambitions for survival. Yet tucked beneath the cleaning supplies in her cart was a single medical textbook, its pages worn from late-night reading, a relic of the life she'd left behind. Her mother's words still echoed in her mind, as clear as the day they were spoken. "You don't need a degree to save a life, sweetheart. You need eyes that see and a heart that cares." Amara had spent 3 years at Sapphire Bay, perfecting the art of invisibility. She moved through the resort's halls with a quiet efficiency, her dark braids pulled back, her movements deliberate but unobtrusive. She knew the rhythms of the place, the way the morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the way the staff whispered about demanding guests, the way the manager, Mr. Wallace, would hover near the wealthiest clients, his smile a practiced mask of deference. She knew the guests' habits, too, the tech executive who left crumpled $100 bills on the nightstand, as tips the actress who demanded fresh lilies daily, the politician who never made eye contact. Ethan Caldwell was different, though. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud, his energy restless even in repose. He'd pace while on calls, his voice sharp as he argued with lawyers or barked at assistants through his phone. His suite was a chaos of scattered papers, half-empty coffee cups, and open laptops, a stark contrast to the pristine order Amara restored each day. She'd learned to navigate his space without disturbing him, slipping in and out while he typed furiously or stared out at the ocean lost in thought. This morning, something broke the rhythm. Amara entered room 1408 as usual, the air heavy with the scent of Ethan's cologne and the faint hum of his laptop. He was still asleep, sprawled across the king-sized bed, one leg exposed beneath the tangled sheets. As she gathered towels from the bathroom, her eyes caught on a mark on his calf, a red circle with a clear center, like a bullseye painted on his skin. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that mark. It was seared into her memory from her mother's textbooks from the late-night study sessions when her mother would quiz her on symptoms and causes. Lyme disease. The bullseye rash was its calling card, a warning that could turn deadly if ignored. Left untreated, the infection could spread to the heart, the brain, the nervous system, causing damage that might never be undone. Amara's hands trembled as she set down the towels, her mind racing. She wasn't a doctor, wasn't even a nurse, just a cleaner with a past she couldn't escape. But she knew what she was looking at, and she knew what it meant. She stood frozen by the bed, watching Ethan's chest rise and fall. His face relaxed in sleep, but etched with the strain of the past weeks. The lawsuits, the pressure, the scrutiny, it was all taking a toll, but this rash wasn't stress. It was something real, something dangerous. Amara's heart pounded as she considered her options. She could say nothing, keep her head down, stay in her lane. That's what the world expected of her. Silence, obedience, invisibility. But her mother's voice cut through the fear as clear as the ocean waves outside. Being right matters more than being heard. Amara took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the faded pin on her uniform. She had to try, even if it meant risking the fragile safety of her job. Her place in this carefully ordered world. Ethan stirred his eyes, fluttering open, as he registered her presence. He sat up, rubbing his face, his expression shifting to the familiar mask of authority. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone sharp, as if her standing there was an intrusion. Amara swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, that mark on your leg, it could be tick-related. It looks like something serious. You should get it checked." Ethan's eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation crossing his face. He glanced at his calf, then back at her, his gaze cold. "Stay in your lane," he said, the words cutting like a blade. "I don't need medical advice from a cleaning lady." Amara flinched, her cheeks burning, but she nodded and stepped back, her hands gripping the cart for stability. She'd expected this, hadn't she? The dismissal, the reminder of her place. But as she pushed her cart toward the door, the image of that bullseye rash stayed with her, vivid and unyielding. She moved through the rest of her shift in a daze, her mind replaying the encounter. Ethan's words stung, but they weren't new. She'd heard variations of them her whole life, from teachers who doubted her potential, from classmates who mocked her ambition, from doctors who'd ignored her mother's pleas. The world had a way of telling people like her to stay small, to stay quiet. But Amara couldn't unsee what she'd seen. The rash was real, and so was the danger. She thought of her mother, who'd spent her life noticing the things others missed, who'd taught her to look for patterns, to trust her instincts. Amara had failed her mother once, staying silent when she should have fought harder, demanded answers. She couldn't fail again, not when she knew what was at stake. As she cleaned the other sweets, her mind churned with memories of her mother's lessons. They'd sit at the kitchen table, textbooks spread out, her mother's voice steady and warm as she explained symptoms, diagnoses, treatments. "Lyme disease is tricky," she'd said once, pointing to a photo of a bullseye rash. "It starts small, but it can destroy a life if you miss it. Always look for the signs, Amara. The smallest details can save someone." Amara had nodded, absorbing every word, dreaming of a future where she'd wear a white coat and carry a stethoscope. That dream had died with her mother, but the knowledge remained locked away in a corner of her heart she rarely visited. Now it was stirring, demanding to be heard. Back in her small apartment above the staff quarters, Amara sat on her narrow bed, the medical textbook open in her lap. The pages were dog-eared, the margins filled with her mother's neat handwriting notes on symptoms, questions to ask, things to watch for. Amara traced the words, her fingers lingering on a passage about Lyme disease. Early detection, critical. Rash may be sole symptom before neurological or cardiac involvement. She closed her eyes, picturing Ethan's calf, the red ring stark against his skin. She knew she was right, but knowing wasn't enough. She was a cleaner, not a doctor. No one would listen to her, not Ethan, not the resort staff, not the medical professionals who'd sweep in with their degrees and their certainty. She thought of her mother's final days, the way she'd begged the doctors to look closer, to consider other possibilities. They hadn't listened, and Amara had lost the only person who'd ever believed in her. She stood pacing the small room, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The apartment was sparse, furnished with the bare essentials provided by the resort: a bed, a table, a single bookshelf crammed with her mother's medical journals. Those journals were her inheritance, the only piece of her mother she could still hold on to. She pulled one from the shelf, flipping to a section on tick-borne illnesses. The words blurred, as her eyes filled with tears, not just for her mother, but for the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed she could make a difference. She'd walked away from that girl, convinced she wasn't enough. But now, faced with Ethan's rash, she felt that girl stirring again, urging her to act. Amara sat at her small desk, her hands trembling as she pulled a piece of paper from a notebook. She wrote carefully, her words precise: "Please test for Lyme disease. Early signs are treatable. Stage 2 affects the heart and brain. Stage 3 can be permanent. Someone who cares." She stared at the note, her heart pounding. It was a risk, her job, her stability, her carefully maintained invisibility. But she couldn't stay silent, not when she knew what was at stake. She folded the note, tucking it into her pocket. Tomorrow she'd find a way to leave it in Ethan's suite, somewhere he'd see it. She didn't know if he'd listen, if he'd take it seriously, but she had to try. Her mother's voice was clear in her mind, stronger than ever. Being right matters more than being heard. Amara clung to those words, a lifeline, in a world that told her she didn't matter. She wasn't a doctor, wasn't a nurse, wasn't anyone important. But she was someone who saw someone who cared, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Amara Johnson pushed her cleaning cart through the gleaming corridors of Sapphire Bay Resort, the wheels whispering against the polished granite floors. The Pacific Ocean glittered beyond the resort's glass walls, its beauty a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside her. 3 days had passed since she'd seen the bullseye rash on Ethan Caldwell's calf. 3 days since his sharp dismissal. Stay in your lane had cut her to the core. She'd tried to warn him, her voice trembling with the weight of knowledge she wasn't supposed to have, but he'd looked through her, his eyes cold with the authority of a man who never questioned his own importance. Amara had retreated, her heart pounding, but the image of that rash lingered like a warning she couldn't ignore. She moved through her shifts with the same quiet efficiency, blending into the background as she always had, but now her eyes were sharper, her senses attuned to every detail of room 1408. Ethan was changing, and not in the way stress or lawsuits could explain. His confident stride, once commanding as he paced during phone calls, had become cautious, almost deliberate, as if each step required focus. His hands, which had signed contracts worth millions, now trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee, the motion so subtle most would miss it. But Amara didn't. She'd been trained by her mother, a nurse who saw the devil in the details to notice what others overlooked. Each morning, as she cleaned Ethan's suite, Amara catalogued the signs. Coffee cups littered the room, half empty and forgotten, scattered across the desk, the nightstand, even the bathroom counter, as if he'd lost track of where he'd set them down. His laptop, always open, displayed the same screen for hours, the cursor blinking untouched while he stared out at the ocean, his expression clouded with something that wasn't just fatigue. The business magazines on his nightstand, once neatly stacked, gathered dust as he dozed during the day, his head lolling against the plush armchair. Amara noticed other things too, the way he rubbed his temples during calls, his fingers pressing harder than necessary, as if trying to force clarity into a mind that was slipping. His voice, once sharp and decisive, now faltered mid-sentence, words eluding him as he searched for thoughts that used to come effortlessly. These were not the symptoms of a man under pressure. They were the markers of something deeper, something Amara recognized from her mother's textbooks. Lyme disease wasn't just a rash. It was a thief stealing strength, memory control. Left untreated, it could reach his heart, his brain, and she knew time was running out. Amara's training, though incomplete, had left her with a nurse's eye for patterns. Her mother had taught her to see the body as a story, each symptom a sentence leading to a diagnosis. But every time she considered speaking up again, Ethan's words echoed in her mind, a reminder of her place in this world of wealth and power. She was a cleaner, not a doctor. Her voice didn't carry the weight of a degree, a title, a name that mattered. She'd learned that lesson 5 years ago, when her mother's concerns were dismissed as nurse anxiety, when doctors with credentials ignored the woman who'd spent decades saving lives. Amara had stood by helpless as her mother's condition worsened, as the misdiagnosis turned fatal. She'd vowed never to let that happen again, but speaking up meant risking everything: her job, her stability, the fragile invisibility that kept her safe in a world that didn't value people like her. On Thursday, the air at Sapphire Bay shifted with the arrival of Dr. Lawrence Bennett. His silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers, his tailored suit and Italian leather shoes marking him as a man of importance. Ethan's personal physician and old family friend Bennett strode through the resort with the confidence of someone whose word was never questioned. Amara, polishing brass fixtures in the hallway, caught his approach from the corner of her eye. She recognized his type instantly: doctors who trusted lab results over people who saw patients as data points rather than stories. The resort manager, Mr. Wallace, escorted Bennett to Ethan's suite, with a deference reserved for the elite, his usual brisk professionalism softening into something almost servile. Amara had worked at Sapphire Bay long enough to understand the hierarchy's subtle shifts when someone like Bennett arrived. Everyone adjusted from the staff to the guests themselves. She kept her head down, her cloth moving in steady circles over the brass, but her ears strained for any sound from room 1408. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the suite's partially open door carried Bennett's voice clearly as she organized cleaning supplies in the walk-in closet. "It's just stress." Ethan Bennett said, his tone smooth with the certainty of a man who'd never been challenged. "These lawsuits, the media scrutiny, it would wear anyone down. The ocean air, the pressure, it's all manifesting physically. A few days of rest, maybe some light walks along the beach, and you'll be fine." Ethan's voice was weaker, tinged with frustration. "What about the joint pain, Lawrence?" "And I keep losing my train of thought, mid-conversation. It's not normal." Bennett's response was dismissive, almost patronizing. "Psychosomatic, my friend. The mind is a powerful thing. I've seen this in executives before your body's reacting to the stress of your legal troubles. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix." Amara's hands froze among the neatly folded towels, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the shelf. She'd heard those words before 5 years ago when her mother's colleagues dismissed her symptoms as occupational hypochondria. The memory hit her like a physical blow, her chest tightening with a familiar mix of anger and helplessness. Ethan pressed further, his voice strained. "What about blood work?" "Just to be sure," Bennett chuckled, the sound dripping with condescension. "Unnecessary. I can diagnose stress without subjecting you to a battery of expensive tests. Trust me, Ethan, I've been practicing medicine longer than that cleaning girl's been alive." The casual cruelty of the statement struck Amara like a slap. She wasn't even a name to him, just a faceless nobody whose existence didn't register. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with a burning resolve. Bennett's dismissal was a mirror of the arrogance that had cost her mother her life, and now it threatened Ethan's. She wanted to storm into the room, to demand they listen, to point to the rash and the symptoms she'd seen with her own eyes. But she stayed rooted in the closet, her breath shallow, knowing her words would be met with the same contempt. That evening, after her shift, Amara retreated to the resort's library, a quiet sanctuary where guests rarely ventured after dinner. The room was lined with mahogany shelves, the air heavy with the scent of old books and leather. She'd come here often to escape, to lose herself in the medical journals she kept hidden in her apartment. But tonight, she just needed to think. She sank into a leather chair, her hands trembling as she replayed Bennett's words. The library was empty, save for the faint hum of the ocean outside, until the door creaked open and Ethan appeared. He looked different, smaller somehow, his broad shoulders slumped, a book clutched in his hands, but unopened. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time, not through her or past her, but at her. The change was so startling, Amara nearly dropped the cloth she'd been fidgeting with. "You're Amara, right?" he asked, his voice hoarse, lacking the sharpness she'd come to expect. She nodded, surprised he knew her name, surprised he was speaking to her at all. In 3 years at Sapphire Bay, guests had called her Miss, or you there, or simply gestured when they needed something. "I keep thinking about what you said." Ethan continued, easing into a chair across from her, wincing slightly as he moved. "About the tick. Why did you notice it?" Amara's throat went dry. This was dangerous territory, the space between who she was and who she'd been forced to become. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice soft but steady. "My mother was a nurse. She taught me to pay attention to things that don't belong. She died 5 years ago, misdiagnosed pneumonia, that was actually a rare autoimmune condition. By the time they figured it out, it was too late. She paused, the words catching in her throat. She'd never spoken them aloud to a stranger, let alone someone like Ethan. The doctors said it was just her imagination that healthcare workers always think they're sicker than they are. Ethan leaned forward, his businessman's instincts catching the weight of her honesty. "Is that why you left nursing school?" The question hit her like a punch, exposing a wound she'd kept hidden. She nodded, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't save her." What was the point of trying to save anyone else? Ethan studied her, his gaze intense but not unkind. "But you still tried to save me." The words hung between them, fragile and true. Amara met his eyes for a moment before looking away, the weight of his acknowledgement, both terrifying and strangely grounding. "Some habits die hard," she said quietly. He nodded, as if recognizing something in her he hadn't seen before. "Your mother sounds like she was remarkable." Amara's voice softened further, almost a whisper. "She was everything. I'm not confident, respected, trusted. She could walk into a room and people listened." Ethan's expression shifted, a flicker of something like respect crossing his face. "Maybe you're more like her than you think." That night in her small apartment above the staff quarters, Amara sat surrounded by her mother's medical journals. The room was sparse, the furniture functional: a bed, a table, a bookshelf crammed with volumes most people would find incomprehensible. She opened a journal, her fingers tracing her mother's neat handwriting, in the margins notes on symptoms, timelines, treatments. Every piece of evidence pointed to Lyme disease. Ethan's joint pain, his memory lapses, the tremor she'd seen in his hands. She knew she was right, but being right wasn't enough. She was a cleaner, not a doctor, and the world didn't listen to people like her. She opened her mother's old nursing bag, untouched for 5 years, but carefully maintained its contents, a reminder of the life she'd walked away from. A stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff, a thermometer, simple tools that had once seemed magical in her mother's hands. Now they represented a choice. Amara took a piece of paper and wrote, her handwriting careful and precise. "Please test for Lyme disease. Early signs are treatable. Stage 2 affects the heart and brain. Stage 3 can be permanent. Someone who cares." She folded the note, her heart racing. It was a risk, a step out of the invisibility that had kept her safe. But her mother's lessons wouldn't let her stay silent. She tucked the note into her pocket, resolving to leave it in Ethan's suite the next morning. She didn't know if he'd read it, if he'd take it seriously, or if Bennett would laugh it off. But she had to try. Her mother's voice echoed in the quiet of her room, a guiding light in the darkness. Being right matters more than being heard. Amara clung to those words, knowing that tomorrow she'd step into the unknown, a cleaner daring to speak when the world demanded her silence. Amara Johnson's hands trembled as she pushed her cleaning cart through the Sapphire Bay Resort's sunlit corridors, the Pacific Ocean's waves a distant murmur beyond the glass walls. It was Friday morning, and the anonymous note she'd left on Ethan Caldwell's nightstand weighed heavily on her mind. "Please test for Lyme disease. Early signs are treatable. Stage 2 affects the heart and brain. Stage 3 can be permanent. Someone who cares." She'd slipped it into his suite before dawn, her heart pounding as she placed it carefully beside his untouched business magazines. She didn't know if he'd read it, if he'd take it seriously, or if Dr. Lawrence Bennett's dismissive laughter would drown it out. The past 3 days had been a quiet torment, watching Ethan's condition worsen while her warnings went unheeded. His once confident stride was now a cautious shuffle, his sharp eyes clouded with confusion, his hands trembling more noticeably as he reached for objects. Amara had seen the signs grow: scattered coffee cups, forgotten tasks, sentences left unfinished as he grasped for words. Her mother's medical journals spread across her apartment's small desk confirmed what she already knew. Lyme disease was stealing Ethan's vitality, and time was running out. Amara's shifts had become a study in observation, her nurse's eye cataloging every change in Ethan's behavior. His handwriting, once bold and decisive, was now shaky with notes abandoned mid-sentence on crumpled papers littering his desk. His laptop, perpetually open, showed browser tabs filled with searches for joint pain memory loss, unexplained fatigue, a desperate attempt to diagnose himself. She'd overheard him on calls, his voice faltering as he struggled to recall names or numbers. A stark contrast to the commanding CEO, who'd dismissed her days earlier. Amara knew the stakes. If the infection reached stage 3, it could cause permanent neurological damage, heart complications, a life altered beyond repair. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a steady guide through her fear. The smallest details can save someone, but speaking up again felt impossible. Ethan's sharp "stay in your lane" still stung, and Bennett's casual cruelty. "I've been practicing medicine longer than that cleaning girl's been alive," had reminded her of her place in this world of wealth and credentials. Thursday afternoon had brought Dr. Bennett back to the resort, his silver hair and tailored suit as impeccable as ever. Amara lingered in the hallway outside room 1408, her cart positioned to look busy while she listened. Bennett's voice carried through the partially open door as confident as ever. "The tremors stress-related, Ethan," he said, his tone dismissive. "Perhaps a mild anxiety disorder triggered by your legal troubles. I can prescribe something for that." Ethan's response was strained, almost pleading. "Lawrence, I feel like my brain's wrapped in fog. I forgot my own phone number yesterday." "This isn't stress." Bennett's reply was sharp, authoritative. "You're a brilliant man, Ethan, but you're not a doctor. Leave the diagnosis to me. These symptoms are textbook executive burnout." Amara's blood ran cold, the words echoing the dismissal her mother had faced 5 years ago. She'd heard the same arrogance, the same refusal to listen, and it had cost her mother everything. Now it threatened Ethan, a man who'd dismissed her, but whose life now hung on the truth she carried. The anonymous note was her last attempt to be heard without stepping into the spotlight. She'd written it with care, her mother's lessons guiding each word, hoping Ethan's doubt would outweigh Bennett's certainty. But when she'd cleaned his suite later that day, she'd overheard Bennett's reaction as Ethan showed him the note. Anonymous medical advice, Bennett had laughed, the sound dripping with contempt. "Lyme disease is a rural myth, Ethan, overdiagnosed by country doctors who don't know better. The chances of you contracting it at a place like Sapphire Bay are 0. Ethan's voice was quieter, uncertain. "What if they're right?" Bennett's response was final. "They're not. You're letting stress make you paranoid." Amara had stood in the suite's closet, her hands clenched, fighting the urge to burst in and demand they listen. But she knew how it would end: another dismissal, another reminder of her place. Friday morning brought the crisis that changed everything. Amara entered room 1408 as usual, the air heavy with the scent of coffee and Ethan's cologne. She expected to find him at his desk, staring blankly at his laptop, but the suite was eerily quiet. A faint groan from the bathroom sent her heart racing. She rushed in and found Ethan collapsed on the marble floor, conscious but struggling, his left arm limp and the left side of his face slack, as if a stroke had stolen half his expression. "Help," he whispered, the word slurred, barely recognizable. Amara's training kicked in, her fear pushed aside by instinct. She dropped to her knees beside him, checking his pulse, rapid but steady. "It's okay, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice calm, despite the panic clawing at her chest. I'm calling for help. You're going to be okay." She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her words clear and precise as she relayed his symptoms to the dispatcher: facial paralysis, tremor, history of a bullseye rash, possible Lyme disease. She stayed with him, her small hand gripping his larger one, offering the only stability in a world that had tilted sideways. "This is treatable," she said, more to herself than to him. "We caught it in time." The paramedics arrived with practiced efficiency, their boots echoing on the granite floors as they wheeled a stretcher into the suite. Amara stepped back, her heart still racing as they assessed Ethan and prepared to transport him. She followed them to the ambulance, her cleaning cart abandoned, her faded nurse pin catching the light as she moved. At the hospital, Dr. Emily Ruiz, a young ER doctor with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took one look at the bullseye rash now starkly visible on Ethan's calf and ordered immediate blood tests. Amara waited in the hallway, her uniform out of place among the sterile white walls, until Dr. Ruiz emerged an hour later. "Lyme disease, stage 2, she said, her voice matter-of-fact but kind. "It's affecting his facial nerves, but he's lucky. If this had progressed to stage 3, we'd be looking at permanent neurological damage. The antibiotics should clear it up, and the paralysis will likely resolve in a few weeks." Amara exhaled relief flooding her body, but the weight of the past days lingered. Ethan, hooked to an antibiotic drip in his hospital bed, stared at the ceiling, his mind grappling with the reality of his condition. "Someone tried to tell me," he said quietly, his voice still slightly slurred. "Someone I didn't listen to." Dr. Ruiz raised an eyebrow. "How did you know to get tested?" "Most people miss these early signs." Ethan's gaze drifted to the window, where the Malibu sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "A cleaning lady saw it. She told me days ago, and I told her to stay in her lane." His words carried a weight of regret, a crack in the armor of a man who'd once thought himself untouchable. "Docteur." Bennett appeared at the doorway, his face ashen as the blood tests laid bare his mistake. The confidence that had defined him was gone, replaced by a fragility that mirrored Ethan's own. "Ethan, he began, but Ethan cut him off, his voice quiet but firm. "Get out, Lawrence. Just get out." Bennett slunk away, his reputation as shattered as his certainty. Ethan asked the nurse to call the resort to find Amara Johnson. He needed to speak to her to thank the woman whose voice he'd dismissed. But Amara wasn't answering her phone. She was in the staff parking lot sitting in her old Honda, a resignation letter clutched in her hands. Tears streamed down her face, 5 years of grief and frustration spilling over. "I can't do this anymore," she told her supervisor who'd tracked her down. "I tried to help someone, and it feels like it's too little too late." Ethan found her there, still in hospital scrubs, moving carefully, but under his own power. The left side of his face remained slightly slack, but his eyes were clearer, more focused than she'd ever seen them. "Amara," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "Don't go." She rolled down her window, wiping tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You're okay," she said, her voice breaking. "That's what matters." Ethan knelt beside her car, bringing himself to her eye level, a gesture that felt impossibly human from a man she'd known only as a commanding presence. "No, what matters is that you have saved my life, and I treated you like you were invisible. I was wrong about you, about what matters, about who deserves to be heard." Amara looked at him, her heart caught between the pain of being overlooked and the strange warmth of being seen. For the first time since her mother's death, something shifted inside her, not healing, not yet, but the possibility of it. Ethan's words, raw and honest, were a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. "I'm not a doctor," she whispered almost to herself. Ethan's lopsided smile was genuine, unguarded. "No, you're something better. You're someone who cares enough to see what others miss." Amara Johnson stood on the balcony of the Sapphire Institute for Collaborative Healthcare, the Pacific Ocean shimmering under the Malibu sun. 3 years had passed since she'd saved Ethan Caldwell's life, a moment that had shifted the trajectory of both their worlds. The Institute, with its glass walls and open spaces, stood as a monument to their shared mission to give voice to the voiceless in healthcare. Amara, once a shy cleaner at Sapphire Bay Resort, now wore a pin that read Chief Observer, a role Ethan had crafted to honor her ability to see what others missed. The Lyme disease that had nearly claimed his life was gone, cleared by antibiotics. But the real healing came from the quiet moments that followed conversations in the resort's library, where Amara shared her mother's medical journals, and Ethan began to see the flaws in a system that valued credentials over care. The Institute was their answer, a place where cleaners, teachers, and family members could contribute to diagnoses, their observations feeding into a revolutionary app that caught illnesses before they became untreatable. Their collaboration had begun in the aftermath of Ethan's crisis, when Amara's anonymous note and quick thinking in calling 911 had saved him from permanent damage. In the resort's library, surrounded by her mother's journals, Amara had shared insights that stunned Ethan. "Your mother saw what medicine ignores," he'd said, flipping through pages of handwritten notes. "She understood that the people closest to patients, nurses, aides, even cleaners notice changes doctors miss." Amara had nodded her fingers, tracing her mother's words. She said technology should amplify human judgment, not replace it. Ethan's vision took shape, a diagnostic tool that collected observations from anyone, no matter their role, and analyzed them for patterns. Amara's knowledge, rooted in her mother's teachings, became the heart of the project, while Ethan's tech expertise brought it to life. The reckoning with Dr. Lawrence Bennett came in a lawyer's office, a stark room where egos were laid bare. Bennett, once untouchable, sat across from them, his confidence eroded by the blood tests that proved Amara right. "You nearly killed me, Ethan," said his voice, calm but unyielding. "Your refusal to listen, to consider that a cleaner might see something you didn't, it almost cost me everything." Amara sat silently, her presence a quiet rebuke. The lawsuit that followed wasn't just about justice. It set a precedent, holding doctors accountable for diagnostic arrogance. The settlement funded the Sapphire Institute, a place where hierarchy gave way to collaboration, where glass walls symbolized transparency and circular tables encouraged equal voices. At a medical technology conference, Ethan and Amara stood before a packed auditorium. "I want to tell you about the day a cleaning lady saved my life." Ethan began recounting his arrogance and Amara's persistence. The audience, a mix of doctors and executives, listened in silence as he challenged their assumptions. "We've built a system that silences the people who see the most," he said. "It's time to listen." Amara stepped forward, her voice steady. "I don't need a degree to care," she said. "We need a system that values wisdom no matter who it comes from." The applause was thunderous, a 7-minute ovation that echoed her mother's belief, "Every voice matters." The Sapphire Institute became a beacon, its app saving lives by catching patterns doctors overlooked. The CDC adopted its model for Lyme surveillance, and Amara, once convinced she was powerless, now saved countless lives. One evening, Ethan handed her a letter from the CDC proposing a nationwide expansion. "Your mother would be proud," Amara said softly. "She'd be amazed," Ethan replied, watching community members learn to spot illness. Amara reflected on her silence in the past. "I used to think I didn't matter," she told Ethan. "Now I know every observation counts." The lesson was profound. Healthcare thrives when all voices are heard. Amara and Ethan's work showed that courage and care, not credentials, save lives. Their institute proved that a shy voice daring to speak could change the world, teaching us to listen to those we've overlooked, because wisdom often comes from the most unexpected places.